is the central trope in this notion. I mean, I think that all the delegates, I think the world was aware of race as a category far more powerfully after the World War II than before. I think you could document this if you look at, well, I'll try to document in a moment, but if you go to the library and type in race as a category, you'll see its increase in the post-war. Well, part of this, of course, is the anti-Nazi, is the Nazi issues of race. And though not as well known in the world, the Japanese ideas of race aren't so great either. And the Japanese trepidations in China were horrible. And the Japanese medical experiments were even more horrible than the German medical experiments based on categories of race. So race is absolutely central to the consciousnness of those who survived this war, which killed 40 million people. Right? That's point one. Point two, I think, in this new world colonialism was over in the Second World War. I mean, it wasn't quite over, and some people in Europe didn't get it yet that it was over, but it was over. It wasn't totally was over intellectually, as you see from this document in some sense. There was no one who could really defend it in a serious way anymore. But politically it was over in the sense that the Japanese in Asia had destroyed the colonial empires. And though, as we know, it takes a long time for people to catch on, the French hadn't quite got it that they've lost Vietnam. The Dutch hadn't quite got it they'd lost Indochina. But they had. And there were some last-ditch efforts, but it was over. So it's, in some sense, in this this rise of anti-colonialism, which Fanon was a part, in which colonialism, which was so much founded on notions of race, as we've talked about, that race also was very much in everyone's consciousness. So the fact that this brings up race again and again and again speaks to this particular political context. And so the gender part becomes actually more important, or is politically more important later on, as the race part becomes less important. There's just not much defense of racism anymore. I mean, that seems to be gone. Now, there's also an American version of this in which the UN Declaration and its arguments against race are actually important in American domestic politics. Anti-lynching legislation had been passed before the Second World War. But as you all know, and as we'll learn more in the coming week, American race laws were, especially in the South, were pretty awful, and a version of apartheid. So it was actually, and as you know, Washington, D.C. is across the border from Virginia. So it didn't go so well when ambassadors of newly independent African countries went to a restaurant across the river, and there was a sign saying whites only, or ambassadors to people from the United Nations. And this, we know now, we have people here worked on it, people other places have worked on it. This was really important in pushing Truman to integrate the armed forces and to push for more integration in different sort of contexts. And it was racism as an overt category played badly in the international arena. So the international, so anti-Nazi, anti-colonial in our country in particular, this declaration was important in the argument against Jim Crow at a national level, if not at a state level. And there's a lot of national state controversy. It's a really interesting and important topic, I think, as you're looking at topics for research papers. The liberal churches are really important in this anti-racist movement, but that's another issue. The last thing the context I want to put it in is this rather remarkable, well, let me backtrack. We'll show you the family of man in a second, but I wanted to show you how deeply this racist story was put in. This was an African woman who was put on display in Paris in the early 19th century. It's a cause célèbre recently, which is why I showed it to you. They were interested in the fact that this large fleshy buttocks were thought to be enticing and interesting to European viewers. So she was captured, she was sold out of slavery and was put on display in Paris by a very famous scientist. And she died, and her genitals and bottom half was put in formaldehyde and sat in the Musée de l'Homme, the major Paris museum, when I was a grad student. So this is not recent history. Her body was repatriated to South Africa 10 years ago, after the fall of the regime. So again, this sort of 19th century history of a certain sort of racism was still very evident in Europe. And that's what people argue, that's the tradition one's arguing against, and that's being sort of made right, if you will, in some sort of fashion. So I just want to remind you, we showed you pictures when we talked about colonialism, but a science of racism was endemic. Both at a popular level, that's what Sarah Bartman shows, and at a scientific level. So what happens after the Second World War are two things. One is that race, in some sense, comes to be spoken about as ethnicity rather than called race, and that a earlier UN document in 1945 actually declared specifically that all humans are from the same origin, that all humans are basically quite humans the same, regardless of race, that nothing follows from what we thought to be racial categories like inferiority or social position. By the late 1940s and early 50s, the category of race was used less and less by social scientists, who came to see it as a social construction, as something that's sometimes mapped onto ethnicity, but in itself is not a category with any biological validity. I don't want to argue about that right now because it's coming back as a category of relevance in biology in a not racist way, in population genetics, for example. But it's still, any of you around last year for Bring Your Genes to Berkeley? Were you guys here for this little controversy? No? Interesting. Last year, you were here. They had a thing, the College of Letters and Sciences has this program every year called On the Same Page. And what they were going to do was they were going to, every freshman was asked to hand in a swab with their DNA in it. Okay, a lot of problems with this. They didn't get proper, the permission was, the consent form was incomprehensible, a lot of problems. But the point was, it's about personalized medicine. The idea was everybody has their own genome, and if we know about your genome, we'll be able to treat you better. And they were just going to illustrate this by having every freshman send this in, and then you're going to put down your race, anonymously, of course. And then they were going to mark it for particular genetic markers. All hell broke loose. It did actually happen. And not surprisingly, everything worked out more or less like you'd expect. So Asian Americans tend to have a higher intolerance for alcohol. And sure enough, the percentage of people who have this particular genetic marker for not good alcohol tolerance more or less corresponds to the percentage of Asian Americans at Berkeley. And likewise, I can't remember what the other three markers were. But it was really still a delicate issue because people asked you to put, I think they didn't say race, they put ethnicity. But clearly it was some biological correlative to what would seem like a racial category. So population geneticists use race all the time in some version or other. I mean, so but in social sciences, it became a kind of an unspoken category. And it's still difficult. People are trying to, it's something we need to talk about, but it's actually hard to talk about it. So my point for right now is not to give you the history of thinking about race, but simply to say that in the late 1940s and early 50s, a long tradition of race in science and social science basically becomes unspeakable. And both at the scientific level and at the popular level. So Look magazine and Life magazine publish articles by these people pointing out that race is no longer a viable category. Culturally, and I want to talk a little bit about that because it speaks to one of the areas of human rights that I'm trying to bring out to you, is an expression of this. And maybe the most popular and most seen photography show in history is this show called The Family of Man, which traveled the world in 1955, but was started to be organized in the late 40s by two more important American photographers. It was an exhibit which toured the world, but it also was in a book called The Family of Man, which I think was translated into 38 languages. I'll check the number, but a large number of languages. It was on every bourgeois coffee table everywhere in the world. And the point, what you can see a little bit of this image, the idea was the family of man are different families, Bush families, European families, some sort of different sorts of peoples. And just to give you the trope, we all have the point of this exhibit of the family of man. They say the greatest photographic exhibit of all time. It probably is one of the great photographic exhibits of all time, in fact. So there's a musician, a South American musician, and there's some musicians. And there's a birth. All people give birth in the same way, and their kids in Japan, and their kids in Harlem. It was a feel-good book, but it was a world that needed a feel-good book. And it speaks to this issue so what I'm trying to say then, race becomes this suspect category. We see this in popularization of science, we see this in what social science talks about, and we see this in a broader cultural front. And that's embodied very much in the Declaration. Okay, so I say I'm not going to do these issues I'm going to talk to you about what's controversial about this. And one of the issues that was controversial, and that was a cause of the Saudi abstention, and caused issues for others, was Article 16, which is about questions of gender. So Article 16 said that men and women of full age, without any limitation due to race, nationality, or religion, have the right to marry and to found a family. We're going to talk about that next week in the American context, in the Perez decision, and in Loving v. Virginia, which argued that, which made illegal in California and then nationally the prohibition of marriage between people of different races, particularly black and white, as it was then understood. And I want you to read, you don't have to read all of Perez, but look at it, but I want you to read the Hannah Arendt piece for next week. It's not long, and it's great on this subject. So the UN Declaration specifically attacks these laws prevalent in America, and Perez falls comes soon after the war. So anti-miscegenation is hard to defend for a signature to this. So that's I think a crucial point, but that's the one issue. The other thing, marriage shall be entered into only with free and full consent of the intending parties. That was much more controversial. No arranged marriages is what this says. Now that's actually a culturally sensitive issue, where you could argue, people did argue that what seemed like arranged marriage are actually full consent, actually do constitute full consent. But the point about this is that the United Nations, the world community, is intruding itself on this intimate family relationship. And it's a relationship which the next part of the article actually acknowledges the family is a founding cornerstone of society. So people argue if a family is the founding cornerstone of the society, and we construct our families this way, by making these claims about the family, you, the United Nations, the community of nations, are interfering in our way of building our society. So that was a central and still is a much controverted part of this document. So the other thing, so the question of gender is crucial. The other question, of course, is this question of social, economic, and cultural, and religious rights. And it argues that every person has the right to practice their religion and should suffer no political or civil liabilities for practicing their religion. Now, we also know that that's not followed in many parts of the world, and that's a very controversial issue, and remains a controversial issue. And of course, finally,